something else or, quote, retire, end quote, I could, but I have no plans to do that because I don't want to retire. I enjoy my work. We're here because we want to be here, not because we have to be here. We're not here because we have to be, and now we're just looking to fill time every day. We're here because we want to make a difference. I want to finish my life knowing that we used our gifts and abilities and we have made a difference in the lives of people. And we get a lot of letters where people are thanking us. I had a lady, her name, I think is Heidi, from South Dakota. And I was standing in a lobby of a Baptist church in South Dakota, Aberdeen, South Dakota, almost, I would say probably 33 years ago. And I don't know how I remember it, but in my mind's eye, I can see it, staying in that lobby. My wife and I were there for the weekend, Pastor Salem's church, Aberdeen, South Dakota, and this young mom with her kids hovering around her legs. And this young mom is saying, I don't think I can homeschool. I really don't think I can do it. And she's almost in tears. And I looked down at those little kids. I looked at her and I said, that's what the left, that's what the liberals, that's what the educrats want you to think. You're an intelligent woman. You can teach them to read and write and do math. Well, today, a year or so ago, Heidi came back into my life, good friends with Tamara Scott, and I was on a broadcast. She was on my broadcast, and she said, I'm that person. Do you remember? I'm like, of course I remember. I don't know how, after all the thousands of people we've come in contact with, how I remember. Not only do I remember, in my mind, I see her as 33 years old with her kids holding on to her leg. These little bitty kids. Now these kids are grown. What is the point I'm making? There's so many families that we have encouraged and impacted. And she said that. She said, you have impacted our family multi-generational. That's what we want to do. That's why we're here. And we need to help people like Alex and his wife. So pray for them. And thanks for listening. Take care.
You are watching Worldview 2, built on the 35 years of Worldview books, documentaries, research, high-profile interviews, and the radio and television broadcasts of brand.
Colonel Rob Maness has a lifelong record of providing dedicated service to this nation. Having worked his way up from the enlisted ranks to full colonel, he served our country for more than 32 years. He has served as a bomber squadron commander, bomb disposal technician, Joint Chiefs of Staff Operations Officer, assisted the national security team with the campaign plan for the global war on terrorism. He authored the first theater nuclear war plan, and served as the Vice Commander of America's largest airborne intelligence wing. Colonel Rob Maness is a true American hero. This is Rob Maness Live.
For people who may not know, I mean, they give advice to the military about what is lawful and what isn't. Not surprisingly, there's been some backlash to those who are worried about their removal. One Georgetown law professor says this: Trump also firing the Army, Navy, and Air Force JAGs. In some ways, that's even more chilling than firing the 4 stars. It's what you do when you're planning to break the law. You get rid of any lawyers who might try to slow you down. Your response to her?
Yeah, I don't know who Rosa is and what her hyperbole is all about. Ultimately, we want lawyers who give sound constitutional advice and don't exist to attempt to be roadblocks to anything that happens in their spots. What we know about these TJAGs, they're called TJAGs inside the military. Traditionally, they've been elected by each other or chosen by each other, which is exactly how it works often with the chairman as well. Small group of insulated officers who perpetuate the status quo. Well, guess what? Status quo hasn't worked very well at the Pentagon. It's time for fresh blood. So we're going to open.
The military service JAGs, they were fired by Secretary Hegseth for a reason. That's the big question. Welcome back to Whistleblower Wednesday here. The Rob Maness Show is live on Worldview Tube, our X Spaces simulcast, Rumble, YouTube, Truth Social Plus, Amazon Fire, and Roku. Well, that's the big question, folks. What is the reason all 3 of the service's top lawyers were removed in the first DOD Friday night firing, as we call them these days? Well, we're going to work through that answer very specifically today because there's a lot going on with the weaponization of the military legal system. Yes, I said it, and you shouldn't take my words lightly because I'm someone who is privileged to wield court-martial authority and supervise JAG officers as a senior commander. I once had absolute faith in the JAG Corps and our system of military justice, but something has gone wrong somewhere. I'm sure it did happen over time, as these things do, including when I was in the service. But the public culmination of this disaster was when whistleblowers revealed our troops in America's military had their rights stripped from them. We see today open law breaking by commanders and a strong record of really bad legal advice by the JAG Corps to those commanders. These actions have resulted in an estimated nearly 100,000 service members being forced to leave doing what they love, serving our country, members who've been physically devastated and are not being compensated for those injuries, and multiple unintended consequences damaging recruiting, which is coming back up, retention, and most importantly, damaging our readiness to fight and win America's wars. Well, I'm honored to have two guests today to help us understand why this firing needed to be done and get to the underlying situation so we can talk about it and get it out in the open. Commander Rob Green is an active duty U.S. Navy commander. He's the author of the book, Defending the Constitution Behind Enemy Lines. He's the author of the Declaration of Military Accountability and was recently honored by President Trump with a Defenders of Freedom Award down at Mar-a-Lago. My second guest today is retired U.S. Navy Captain Dan McCarthy. He is a Naval Academy graduate, was a surface warfare officer who was selected, which is a competitive selection, for the law education program. He graduated from Duke Law School with honors and graduated at the master's level from George Washington Law with the highest honors you can get. He's also served in the Navy JAG Corps, including multiple tours as trial counsel in field commands around the world, was an executive assistant to the Judge Advocate General, and was special assistant for legal issues to the Secretary of the Navy, and was a commanding officer. That's a big resume for a U.S. Navy lawyer. Dan's post-military career is just as exceptional. He served veterans in city government. He's been a chief assistant state attorney and served at the Court of Appeals level. He's currently the federal special master at the D.C. Circuit Court, assisting with Foreign Service Immunity Act claims filed against, guess who? The Islamic Republic of Iran, the biggest state sponsor of terrorism in the world. And those claims are by U.S. military personnel killed and injured in Iraq. Rob, welcome back to the show. And Dan, welcome to the Rob Maness Show for the first time. Thank you both for spending some time with us.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Yes, I agree, Colonel.
Well, guys, let me pitch this first question out to both of you and just give me your takes based on your experience and what you've seen. What the core issue is as for these firings of all three service JAGs all at the same time.
Well, I normally would need to defer to the gentleman with the significant resume that you just read. What an honor to be here with him talking to you today. But I'll just give a quick one-liner on that. We have, over the last almost couple decades, lost touch with what the Constitution fundamentally means, and the law profession in the Navy is due for a reset. And I'll start with that, and then I'll turn it over.
Well,
Dan,
thank you, Rob.
based on your, go ahead.
I said thank you, Colonel, and I appreciate the introduction. That was yesterday. What we're here to talk about now is the brave men and women patriots that serve every day, and our concern that they receive the best possible support, mentoring, legal advice, and leadership. And I think that we have reason to be concerned about that.
Yeah, we do. And as Rob mentioned and Secretary Hegseth mentioned in the little opening clip there, we want attorneys that are, Judge Advocate General attorneys that will give sound constitutional advice and not be wedded to things like institutional norms, wedded to protecting the institution itself. And I think that's a big part of the issue, Dan. You've served at every level, I think. Can you give us some insight historically as to how we might have gotten here based on what you saw?
Well, I certainly know how it's changed. And I can tell you, I had the great benefit or opportunity or blessing to serve for Secretary of the Navy John Dalton from 1992 to 1998. I had 6 years as his legal advisor, which is an extended period. Most that position is usually a 1-year position. It just happened, if you'll think back to the early 90s, that Tailhook came along. And the more I worked with Secretary Dalton on Tailhook, the more he wanted me to stay, and he wanted me to remain part of his team as long as he was the Secretary of the Navy. And one of the things that's critical, if you're going to be the legal advisor in situations like this, is not to say yes, but to say no when no is the right answer. Very often the military can get caught up a little bit in what they're trying to accomplish, or enthusiastically believe that they can, well, we can do this, this, and this. The judge advocate's role is to tell the secretary what the law is, and then give him his options and possibly make a recommendation as to which option is appropriate. What appears to have happened is that we brought in a number of people for whatever reason. I've had some reason to believe that perhaps it was a focus on DEI and woke sort of thinking. We brought in a group of JAGs that became yes men. And yes men do not serve either their leader well or the men and women that put their uniform on every day and go out there and put their life at risk for the safety and freedom of this country. So once we had a few issues that seemed to show that very clearly. One was the mandatory vaccination program. I knew as soon as I heard it that can't be legal. And I was consulted by a few people, and I said, just, fight it. It's not right. There is no legal authority to separate people for not taking an experimental drug. And some tried to argue back to me at the time that it's not an experimental drug, that it's FDA approved. And even if the two drugs, the one that was FDA approved and the one that was being utilized in the Department of Defense, that they were close enough. But I can tell you, for instance, I had the benefit of having some great children. And my first son, John, went to the Naval Academy, and he was a surface officer, and he was a doctor. And as soon as it happened, he called me and he said, Dad, don't take it. It's not FDA approved. And what they're offering is a substitute that is not legally approved. He didn't take it in his work with a large medical organization that wanted their doctors to take the vaccine. And he resisted that, although it did not have career consequences for him. Instead, though, we put career consequences on men and women that had served valiantly in combat, had put their life on the line, had carried out men and women that had been hurt, and had just served as nobly and valiantly as you can serve in the military. So to suddenly give them a do or die kind of proposal, and then to know that it wasn't legal, and that somebody needed to stand up and say that's not legal. And guess who that person should have been? The judge advocate. He should have read the law, and he should have come into his boss and said, sir, this is close, but it's not good enough. And you cannot create a mandatory program and terminate careers and affect people's lives dramatically unless you're right about the law. And in this instance, the leaders needed good judge advocates who understood that their role was not just to say yes because everybody's kind of feeling that way, and the momentum is, oh, of course we can do this, and politicians were telling them they could do it. The role of the judge advocate is to go read the law very, very carefully and then come back and present that to his leader, whoever that, he or she's leader, whoever that may be. And I think their failure has created a whole series of, I don't like calling them victims because they're patriots that were misserved by judge advocates whose role was to read the law, know the Constitution, and present those options to the men and women that are trying to make good decisions.
Absolutely right, sir. I got to do something here real quick. I forgot to do it before I asked you guys the first question. Let me read this disclaimer. Look, none of the comments that me or Captain McCarthy or Commander Green are saying are endorsed by the Department of Defense, the Department of the Air Force, or the Department of the Navy. We don't speak for them. We're speaking in our own right. And Rob, just to come back to you, tell the folks what the repercussions of this systemic inability of the JAG officers to say no to the commanders has been. Just refresh their memories.
Oh, it's been very painful for many service members who, for reasons of conscience, decided that they could not take these experimental products. And, we had, service members that ended up homeless. They were kicked out with days to spare from military housing. Like, hey, here's your notification, get out. We provide sometimes as long as 18 months for all judicial proceedings and all rights to be protected for service members that commit all kinds of violations, very serious crimes, and we don't treat them like we did over this vaccine mandate. We had a sailor that was reported to me, that within days of it happening, the sailor committed suicide. He was in lockdown. He was being treated terribly. It was a Navy SEAL, very capable sailor, and only jobs that he was given was doing manual labor. I was told that the last thing that this sailor did to support his country, the last job he was given was to do the yard work outside the building. He was no longer permitted to enter. These were the kinds of things that were happening to sailors, happening to service members across all branches, because the JAG Corps stopped trying to defend constitutional rights, and they started trying to find a way, loopholes and word nonsense, tried to find a way to let commanders get to yes and defend commanders from legal actions after the fact. Those are the kinds of things that were happening. And we had a number of whistleblower reprisal cases. Some of them are still ongoing. And this is not just exclusively a COVID problem. Captain McCarthy explained that very well, yeah. But we had these issues across a broad spectrum of areas.
Yeah, we got to take a commercial break. When we come back, we'll see a little clip from the fake news about the firings. But I want to continue this discussion, Rob and Captain McCarthy, about the impacts of this decision-making and take it beyond the COVID. That's a perfect segue, because this has really dramatic effects and unintended consequences that are reverberating even today. And we'll talk some more about those when we come back on the Rob Maness Show here on Whistleblower Wednesday.
Hello, I'm Brandon House. I want to thank you for all your support at wvwfoundation.com that helps make possible pushing out 24/7 content for free. Without your support, we'd have to put it all behind a paywall. But thanks to you and your support through our foundation, we're able to push it out for free as a broadcast service and broadcast ministry of WVW Foundation. Please consider going there and setting up an automatic monthly contribution, or go there and make an occasional contribution. If you prefer to support us through the mail, you'll find our mailing address there at wvwfoundation.com. You can also call and make your contribution over the phone by calling 901-825-0652. That's 901-825-0652. Again, all these details are available at wvwfoundation.com. Thank you for your support as we try to help people around the world understand the times through the lens of a Christian worldview.
Last week, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth fired top lawyers across the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. The fired lawyers are called Judge Advocates General, or JAGs. JAGs are responsible for ensuring that the military adheres to U.S. law and international rules for war.
Georgetown law professor says this: Trump also firing the Army, Navy, and Air Force JAGs. In some ways, that's even more chilling than firing the 4 stars. It's what you do when you're planning to break the law. You get rid of any lawyers who might try to slow you down.
We want lawyers who give sound constitutional advice and don't exist to attempt to be roadblocks to anything.
During his last term, Trump suggested using the military to suppress protests. and even firing upon US citizens. Legal experts warn that these ideas are dangerous and potentially illegal. But with the firing of JAGs, these ideas could actually move forward. And that's the biggest concern, that by firing these top legal officers, there's a real danger that loyalty to Trump could start to outweigh loyalty to the Constitution. Military lawyers traditionally ensure that the rule of law is upheld, something that is vital for maintaining America's democratic ideals. If the military shifts its focus to loyalty to one man rather than the Constitution, the foundation of justice could crumble. This would be a dangerous shift to how the military operates. What happens when loyalty to the Constitution is replaced by loyalty to one man? What do you think?
Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show. It's Whistleblower Wednesday, and we're discussing with two great guests, U.S. Navy Commander Rob Green and retired U.S. Navy Captain and JAG Officer Dan McCarthy, the firing of the senior service JAG officers all at once and why. And guys, I wanted to show that clip because the fake news likes to blow the warning horn. But as you could see, as he stepped through there, there's a lot of contradictions. And as we talked about in the first segment, the issue is not that the JAGs were trying to uphold the law and say no, which is what needed to happen in the COVID situation, is that they were doing the exact opposite. Am I wrong there, Dan?
Colonel, you've hit it right on the head. And I'm going to say something that I learned from my years in the E-ring that I'm sure you know quite well, Colonel. There are two kinds of courage that military people are called on to represent. One is battlefield courage. That's instinctive. That's men and women, disregarding the danger or the peril to try and complete a mission or serve the man or woman that's working next to them. And that's something that we give medals for, battlefield courage. There's a second kind of courage that lawyers face, and also administrative people in something like the E-ring that are maybe serving on a large staff. And that is, do you have the courage to say no when everybody in the room would like to hear yes? And that takes a different kind of courage, because you'll be ostracized possibly. You might be threatened with what your next job will be or something else. I could give you countless examples from my 6 years. I remember once being in the room with the Chief of Naval Operations and the Secretary of the Navy, the CNO of 4-star. I was at the time a baby captain. The CNO had a certain proposal and plan that he wanted to convince the Secretary of the Navy to do. The Secretary asked me to be present. It was just the three of us at the table. The CNO presented his idea. The problem with the idea, I understood why he wanted to do it, but there were statutes that conflicted with what he wanted to do, and it affected personnel. And after the Secretary listened to him, he looked at me and said, "Okay, JAG, tell me what you think." And I knew it wasn't a great time to disagree with the Chief of Naval Operations in a very small meeting. But I said, "Mr. Secretary, you could do that, but it would be illegal." And the Secretary just looked at the CNO and said, "I'm sorry, we aren't going to follow through with this particular recommendation." When I walked out of the room, if the CNO could have strangled me, he also, and this was a rather meaningful line I've never forgotten, he said, "Mr. Secretary, there's two kinds of people in this world, shooters and non-shooters." So in the CNO's mind, I was a non-shooter. I was a lawyer. But as you can see, my job was to display the administrative courage necessary to say, no, that's not legal. And what we have now, and I could not support or commend Secretary Hegseth more than for him to realize, not only do I need a new chairman of a Joint Chiefs of Staff, but I need new lawyers, because I have lawyers that authorized something that's entirely unconstitutional and hit them with an injustice they didn't deserve, to have to make a decision about their career, to have to think about how the men and women they served with would see them, how their commander might view them. I mean, your health is a personal matter, and whether to take an experimental drug at the consequence of you'll be thrown out of the military is a pretty devastating decision. And the thought that lawyers who should have stepped forward and say, no, don't put them in that position. This is not a policy that you should support. Instead, we had everybody in the room wanting to do it because the political leaders wanted it done. And I'm afraid that the men and women serving in uniform were poorly served by their leaders and poorly served by the judge advocate. And I sort of laugh when I hear law professors that haven't been there and don't really understand try and give us some explanation why the recommendation by the judge advocate is so critical, and that how if a leader were to propose selecting someone differently, that would somehow be a dark moment for the military. And the truth is, you need courageous lawyers just as much as you need courageous militia folks or Rangers or SEALs or Green Beret. You need men and women that are willing to put their careers and their performance on the line when they know that something isn't right. And Secretary Hegseth did exactly what the men and women of the Department of Defense deserve, and that's lawyers that will read the law and also seek to respect the service of the men and women that they're making decisions about. In a lot of ways, lawyers have it pretty easy. We work at a desk. I lived in the Philippines 4 years. I did some other things, but what I was called on to do, compared to what pilots and submariners and surface warfare officers and Marines are called on to do, my contribution was insignificant compared to theirs. My role was to read the Constitution, study the law carefully, and provide the leaders and the men and women in uniform with correct legal advice.
Yeah, I mean, I could see where the CNO that was in the meeting is coming from. I've been a senior commander myself, and I've always told my JAGs, you advise and then I decide. But if the JAGs are advising in contrariance to the law, then and I don't know it, and I make a decision against the advice anyway, then there's a whole lot of unintended consequences that can come from that, or the other way around, where they give good advice and then I make the decision and it goes against the advice, and then I accept the responsibility for that. But you're exactly Colonel, need with that courage to be able to stand in the breach.
Colonel, it's also up to the military leader to make sure he empowers his JAG, that your job's to tell me the truth. Secretary of Navy used to always laugh with me, and if I ever have to go to jail, you're coming with me, because your job was to make sure I didn't do something illegal. And good commanders empower their subordinates to tell the truth, even if the truth may not be as popular as maybe seeing it in a way that they're kind of running with the herd. The herd wants the answer to be yes. It's easy to walk in and say yes because they'll like you more. But if you walk in and say, I'm sorry, that's not the best approach, the Secretary used to always tell me, give me a better approach then too. Don't just walk in and shake your head. Come in here and give me some different alternatives. But in the end, the commander has to empower his Judge Advocate General to tell the truth so that he can walk in and give the best possible advice without fear of repercussion. So I'm sure, Colonel, when you were that guy, you were making sure your JAG knew your job first and foremost is to give me constitutionally accurate legal advice. And hopefully it always matches with what I want to do.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Well, we've got a live audience here. We got a couple of questions that I'm going to take one question now for us. Our host over there is Shell. Shell, who's got a question?
We have Colonel Gannon Burton, sir.
Hey, Colonel Maness, captains, thank you guys for your service. Hey, one thing I think it's very clear now. Thank you so much for spelling out how clear it is that this was in legal order with these vaccine mandates. Anyone being, I think where we were failed also was there were a lot of service members that came forward, refused, but then they didn't get what was clearly obvious legal advice, right, from and support through that process, and they were targeted. And then the other thing on this is that we're talking about it as if it was a failure of, it wasn't just a failure of the law here, it was a failure of observation of command, because people started coming down with injuries because of the vaccines. And by the summer, we know it should have been stopped because we saw that the rates of miscarriage going up, and the Navy silenced that as too. So we have a much broader, deeper thing than just fixing the JAGS piece on this. We have an active cover-up of a crime scene, as far as I'm concerned. But I'd like to get your thoughts on that, and then anything you can speak to of how do we actually, fix this and get some semblance of accountability for it. Thank you.
Yeah, great observations and a question about the further unintended consequences, Rob. And you were mentioning that this goes far beyond just the COVID issue. And Colonel Burton was talking about the cascading effects, but cascading into maybe the COVID treatment and how people were treated inappropriately and illegally in that context. But it's still cascading through the force, isn't it, today? In different circumstances.
It certainly is cascading through the force, and the portion I'm going to take a portion of that question, and I'm going to defer to Captain McCarthy. The accountability piece, I definitely want Captain McCarthy to take that part of the question. But as far as the other part, the impacts of this, I would say the most important thing is trust. We have now destroyed trust with service members over this. When you had the injuries, you had the indications of the unlawfulness, made aware to the commanders, made aware through the JAG channels and other channels, through numerous, probably thousands of complaints and reports internally from service members like me that stood up to this. They had an opportunity to put a pause on this, to recommend somebody with that, as Captain McCarthy describes it, administrative courage. I call it moral courage. But we did not have that at the most senior ranks. And so what ended up happening was a betrayal of trust. And now we have institutional trust that only just now we're trying to rebuild through the efforts of Secretary Hegseth and others. I would say that the JAG Corps, this was self-inflicted. Since I've gone public and I've written a book about some of this, I've had whistleblowers coming out of the woodwork to me to share additional information. And so I had, information from whistleblowers that JAGs, the last two TJAGs, apparently committed UCMJ violations and were actively covering up their own potential crimes. And so I reported that up to up through the chain of command. I got that over to the FBI as well in a report, and the NCIS has actually opened an investigation into the last two TJAGs. And so we have a problem where these two individuals had come up through the ranks and were a large part of, as was described before, they were picking who the leaders were. They were deciding who got the plum assignments. They were the ones making sure that they passed the baton on to more of their own people. And if they were disregarding the law and covering up some of their own crimes, which a full investigation needs to determine what exactly happened, but there is an active investigation right now with NCIS. So if that's the case and that's what they were doing, we have a severe problem, because the next group of people coming up behind them in the JAG Corps were the people that these people selected.
Yeah, well, we got to take another break. Captain McCarthy, when we come back, I want to dive into what Rob was talking about with this accountability piece, because we need someone with your experience level to help us understand how that needs to work, because as Rob pointed out, we're in a critical moment here where we're trying to regain trust in our entire institution, and it's very difficult to do. So we've got to keep cooler heads and move forward, but in the right way. We'll be right back with retired Captain Dan McCarthy and Commander Rob Green.
Hello, I'm Brandon House. Is the government tracking you? Do they have access to all your data? Well, if you go to worldviewtalk.com, you'll find out about a cell phone company that, well, does not store your data. They don't do that. This is what they're known for. They don't store your data. You have privacy. You're not being tracked. That's why a lot of folks are turning to worldviewtalk.com. You'll find their prices are very competitive. All the details are there at worldviewtalk.com. Again, worldviewtalk.com. Oh, while you're there, not only do they have cell phones that aren't tracking you, you can find out about how to get a satellite phone. Should the whole system go down and you want to communicate with a family member or a loved one, you might want to have a satellite phone. Or how about their solar generators? They have great solar generators. Check them all out right now. Worldviewtalk.com, worldviewtalk.com.
This past Friday, the Secretary of Defense announced that he's replacing the judge.
Experts say that Russian hackers found a way to hack our utilities.
This past Friday, the Secretary of Defense announced that he's replacing the Judge Advocates General of all the military services. The media and pundits are predicting a crisis, but noticeably with zero specifics. Former Secretary of the Air Force, Frank Kendall, said that this truly frightens him because these are the people that interpret the Uniform Code of Military Justice and the people who have independent legal authority to tell any military commander that an order from the President or the Secretary of Defense is unlawful and cannot be obeyed. While this is an accurate description of the job function, Kendall offers zero argument as to whether the officials being replaced were faithfully executing that function. I can't speak for the Army or the Air Force, but I have definite personal opinions about the Navy. Of the last 4 Judge Advocates General of the Navy, 1 was found to have committed unlawful command influence by interfering in a court-martial for political purposes to keep an innocent man in jail. 1 received a report of felony criminal conduct by another JAG admiral, and not only buried it, but actually named that admiral as his own successor. And the most recent Judge Advocate General, who rushed a retirement package 2.5 months into the job, probably to avoid being prosecuted himself for misconduct. A retired military judge told CNN that the move to replace JAGs is extremely concerning because they serve as the conscience of the military and the moral guide for what's right or wrong. Nobody's offering a specific defense as to why the outgoing JAGs served as an effective conscience or moral guide, because they can't. The status quo in the military justice system has failed our warriors. I have full faith in Secretary Hegseth that he will ensure that smart and ethical leaders are appointed to fill these roles and to serve as the conscious and moral guide that our military needs.
Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show. It's Whistleblower Wednesday, and we're talking with some great expert guests on the firing of the senior Judge Advocate General officers from each service, and that was Tim Parlator commenting on what some of the comments from the establishment have been. And my guest today is Navy Commander Rob Green, an author, an active duty Navy officer, and he wrote the book Defending a Constitution Behind Enemy Lines about the issues associated with the illegal actions during the COVID crisis and how folks worked behind the scenes and behind those enemy lines to try to protect the Constitution. And my other guest is retired U.S. Navy Captain JAG, Dan McCarthy. And Dan, the big question is accountability. Tim mentioned Frank Kendall there, the former Secretary of the Air Force. And one of the illegal things that he did was, and we have this in a sworn deposition that was in a courtroom in a trial, one of the trials, that he called all of his generals into a room at the regular general meeting called Corona in the Air Force and said there will be no religious exemptions in direct violation of the RFRA Act that was passed after the anthrax vaccine debacle. And accountability has to happen to reestablish the trust that Rob was talking about before we went to the break. What should we be looking for to achieve real accountability?
Well, Colonel, those are really good questions. And I would be happy to just kind of walk you through what the options are and what the various issues that surround the options. If I could backtrack first, just to make sure everybody understands, one thing I neglected to mention in my first kind of commentaries was you need to understand that 3- and 4-star admirals and generals are in what they call positions of special trust and responsibility. And they get appointed by the civilian leadership. So unfortunately, the military system almost creates those that are aspiring to a 3rd and 4th star can have a tendency to want to give the political leaders what they want, so they'll get appointed to those 3- and 4-star positions. So when it became clear that some of the civilian leadership wanted to press the vaccine, for instance, and we could talk about some of the other areas, not just the vaccine, but in essence, you have some motivation for 3- and 4-star admirals and generals to go along with the program. That filters down to the JAGs too. If you want to be liked by the 3- and 4-star all the time, the best thing is to tell him, sure, you can do that, because he wants to do it to satisfy his civilian leaders. Lost in all this is the sailor, is commanders like Rob that are down there trying to do the right job, but also have their own view of what's morally courageous and ways that we should be serving based on the training that Rob got throughout his career and at the Naval Academy, and the belief that we're a constitutional Navy that works hard to follow the law. So with that as a background, we now have the problem that some of our leaders ignored the law, and some of our judge advocates lacked the courage to reveal the law. So what do you do? And that's now the sort of accountability question. The first sort of, I guess, decision you have to make is, do you even want to go back and mess with it? Could you just say, that was yesterday, there's new leadership, let's move forward and deal with the problems in front of us, not the ones behind us? But I don't think that's a good idea, for the very reason, Colonel, that you said. People have to trust and have confidence that their leaders are going to do things right, and that their lawyers are going to provide accurate legal information and legal advice. And when they don't, military people know that military is full of an accountability system that demands excellence and skilled performance. We don't hesitate to fire a commanding officer of a ship if he runs aground, or an aviator if he makes a mistake while flying, or a nuclear submariner if he makes a bad decision or poor judgment. So why then should we just give a free pass to the leaders and the lawyers that obviously did not demonstrate the courage and the conviction and the leadership that we would hope for? So if you pass question 1, yes, let's have some accountability. I've read many articles by people that are upset about what's gone on, and one of the first things they'll say is, well, let's recall them to active duty and court-martial them for failures of leadership. You could try to do that in some cases. It is true that retirees remain subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and they can be recalled to be held accountable for mistakes they made on active duty, which surface after they're retired. So if the group that wants to recall and then charge and take these to court, there's just so many obstacles with doing that it's just not realistic. For instance, if you were trying to bring back either, let's say, General Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, first off, the military uniform code for military process and courts-martials are just not designed for trying senior leaders. Members that sit, let's say jurists, if you will, that sit are supposed to be senior to the individual charged. How are you going to bring in a panel that's senior to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, for instance? Also, who's going to charge the chairman of the Joint Chiefs? The Secretary of Defense personally, or are you going to lower it to a 1 or 2 star to bring charges against a 3 or 4 star admiral or general? It just gets very, very complicated. Who sits as the military judge? Who prosecutes the 4-star? What kind of witnesses are you going to have? Is the president going to be called as a witness to say, well, here's what I told the chairman that I wanted done, or Are you going to have to call a lot of other 3 and 4 stars to say this is what went on when we were formulating the policies and the judgment, etc.? So I would recommend against the recall and court-martial option. I just don't think the Uniform Code of Military Justice is designed or equipped to handle those fairly. So if you take the sort of court-martial off the table, then what's left? And I will tell you what usually happens in these cases and what I would suggest is the best option. Under 10 U.S. Code 1370, you can conduct what they call a grade officer determination. And these are administrative reviews done by leaders, a civilian leader or a military leader, that could look at the underlying conduct of the military officer that's in question and make a decision about what is the last pay grade they serve satisfactorily in. We get retired in the last pay grade we serve satisfactorily in. So the question would be, could you put together a panel, let's say, that looked at the actions of the senior military officers and the senior judge advocates, and maybe some others, maybe some senior doctors that didn't provide good advice about the vaccine, for instance, or others, and make a decision when did they last and what pay grade did they last serve in satisfactorily. That is a purely administrative review. It's up to the Secretary of Defense or the service secretaries. And if there's certain rules, if it's a 3 or a 4 star, it has to be done by the Secretary of Defense, and the President and the Senate have to be informed if they're reviewed. If they're reduced a pay grade to 3 star, it would have to go to the President for approval. If they were reduced below that to 2 star or less, it can be done by the service secretary if delegated from the Secretary of Defense. So the bottom line is the UCMJ and federal law provide for a mechanism to review the conduct of senior officers and lawyers and other military officers to determine what pay grade they deserve to be retired in. And I would be a proponent of, if you agree that there should be some accountability, that the right accountability is an administrative review conducted to determine what's the last pay grade that these officers served in satisfactorily, and then make a judgment on that and demote the officers that didn't live up to their responsibilities. It's not unheard of. In 2017, there was an Air Force 2-star that was, or 4-star, excuse me, that was retired as a 2-star. I can think back to my days in the Secretariat. There were times we sent flag officers home with a demoted pay rank. And they would, of course, would then not receive the benefits of the title of whatever position that they were kind of removed from. They would also lose some of their retirement pay for their misconduct, for their failure to sort of have the moral courage that Rob talked about to do the right thing.
That's a great answer. We got to take our last break. When we come back, I want to continue this, Dan, and bring Rob in here and talk about some of the follow-on law breaking that we're hearing about. I know he's reported on it and actually submitted whistleblower information to the NCIS and the JAG Corps in the Navy. And I want to get your take on, how do you hold the lower echelons of command and supervision accountable, especially the ones that may still be on active duty beyond just the 3 and 4 stars? We'll be right back with the Rob Maness Show here on Whistleblower Wednesday.
finally won. And at the end of our lawsuit, part of the agreement from the military was that they would clean everybody's record. Nobody would ever be stopped or hindered in any way in their advancement.
Yeah.
All that. We won everything we could win. The problem is, I don't want to get real technical, but the law in suing, as you might guess, the law is not real easy to sue the military and get money, okay? Because everybody be doing that, right?
Yeah.
So we couldn't really get that in this case. We could get everything else, and we did win. But what President Trump just did is what we couldn't get. We couldn't force them to reinstate people. Yeah. We couldn't force them to give their back pay.
What we won was to protect them going forward. But
Right.
what President Trump is talking about is restoring what
That's
happened
right.
to them in the past.
That's right.
In a monetary fashion of giving them cash.
And it was very important that we win going forward because it affects everybody who will decide to go into the military in the future.
Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show. It's Whistleblower Wednesday, and I've got two great guests, Navy Commander Rob Green with me today and retired U.S. Navy Captain Dan McCarthy, who is also a JAG in the United States Navy. So that this discussion of removing the senior JAGs in each of the services and the law breaking amongst beyond just the JAGs, but senior officers, mid-level officers, even NCOs in how they were enforcing the COVID vaccine mandate order, which turned out to be unlawful in its own right, but also some other law breaking that's going on. And Rob, I'll come to you first because you've been putting out some information that Parlator in the clip before last mentioned that senior JAGs like Admiral French resigned 2.5 months into his time as the senior Navy JAG. All of a sudden, the other instances of Navy JAG Admiral is openly defying the executive order that President Trump signed about removing DEI and woke ideology by just renaming it, which he explicitly said we're not going to do. That type of law breaking is bubbling up. But as we've talked about, it goes well beyond just the JAG Corps and the unintended consequences, and goes right into the heart of what the U.S. Armed Forces needs to be the most. The troops have to have trust and confidence in the senior leadership, but also at the same time, we have to believe our oaths that we're protecting and defending the Constitution of the United States so that we can maintain readiness and be ready to go to war when we're called upon to do that. And I see the weaknesses that have been imparted all the way down that chain of command as a major issue that we've got to get addressed. I mean, your situation, Rob, is you've been being looked at to be charged, from what I could tell in the reporting and what you've posted online, by the very justice system that you've been trying to help blow the whistle on. So we've got to get back to where we've fixed and repaired the entire chain of command, don't we?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And my focus is not the past. I mean, although we need accountability, and I love hearing about the great determination approach. It's one of the things that I've really enjoyed as I've gotten to know Captain McCarthy better recently, and we've had discussions about this. I have absolutely fallen in love with the great determination approach for the highest level leaders. If you could just hold a few of them accountable, it's a deterrent going forward for future actions for the senior ranks. Now, at the lower ranks, it's why I mentioned before about the compromise of the JAG Corps, compromise of our lower ranks, because when you don't put principles first and you become outcome dependent, you end up in situations where what things that have happened to me, and I'll just give my own case as an example, because I continue to get more whistleblowers seeing what I have done and having the courage to come forward. I get a ton of information about unlawfulness that's occurring. The things that I can vet, I'm making sure that I'm reporting through proper channels as I'm, obligated to do by military policy. I have a duty to report things that are crimes or appear to be crimes, and so I'm doing what I can. But then after reporting these things, and this has happened as recently as 3 weeks ago, I was informed that that the JAG Corps did a prosecution review on me. They began scrubbing my social media and trying to find a way to find something that they could get me on. And they actually had meetings about me. They assigned people time to study me. And instead of trying to get at some of these underlying problems that I'm presenting to them, they tried to find a way to weaponize that system against me. And if that's happening to me, a person who's been public for 3 years now and have written a book, I've been honored by people, and I think I'm, woefully undeserving of a lot of that. But if it's happening to me, as public as I have been, what is it happening to the E5 out there who's reporting? What's happening to the lieutenant, the captain out there? Say a Marine Corps, Air Force captain. What's happening to them when they report up their chain of command that they are seeing problems? The IG system, the JAG Corps system, it's broken, and it's broken at these middle levels. And so I love what Secretary Hegseth is doing. I love the approach that we're taking, trying to get back to properly ordered principles and the Constitution. And so my encouragement for all of those, kind of at my level and below, is to hang on tight, keep doing the right thing, and I think help is on the way.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Rob. And Captain McCarthy, Rob goes right where I'm at as I'm thinking about the junior NCOs, the junior to mid-level officers, and their supervision. Battalion commander, company or squadron commanders, that level of command of the NCOs and officers in charge of that. We saw what they did during COVID, where they embraced this. Many of them did, not all, but many of them did. And it's hurt the people that were put out or felt like they were forced to leave and those kind of things under the COVID thing. But we continue to see this type of law breaking happen at this command level in the middle of the chain of command. How do we identify and hold those folks accountable within the system, beyond doing a grade determination for senior officers? Because we've got to hold the folks that were doing the wrong thing accountable somehow at the mid-level of command in order to reestablish that entire stream of trust that needs to be in the Department of Defense.
I couldn't agree more. I have great respect for what I've heard Rob say, and you, Colonel. The approaches that you're taking are exactly the right answer. It does become a question of volume, though. Like, if you're going to agree that people issued illegal orders, they destroyed people's lives, and they should be accountable. And it isn't one or two. There was 8,500 military personnel that were impacted. Just in my interaction with Rob most recently, I'm learning more and more and more about injustices that have occurred in the military while everybody stood and watched. And it's aggravating. It's aggravating to me. I've been proud of my military career. I'm not proud to learn that there are men and women who have given everything for this country and then run over by their leaders, run over by the JAGs, simply because they had a political cause that seemed more important to them. I guess I would differ a little, Colonel, with you in that if it gets too big and you start identifying too many to try to discipline, that it'll just all come apart and we won't get there. So my suggestion would be hold the seniors most accountable. I mean, hold Secretary Austin. He's a retired 4-star general. He was in charge of the Department of Defense when 8,500 people were treated poorly. He was also in charge of the Department of Defense when the whole Afghanistan debacle occurred. We also have other senior 3- and 4-star admirals and leaders of the JAG Corps, the Medical Corps. Hold them accountable in some way. And if you do that, the subordinates will get the picture and they'll applaud it. That thank goodness there was equal strokes for equal ranks, and that you had to follow the rules, not enforce them on others, and then sneak out once it becomes clear that you didn't honor the UCMJ, and you didn't honor the responsibilities of your rank. And so while I certainly agree, trying to decide how far down do we go? Do we get the 06s that were in charge of larger commands? Do we get 05s that ran smaller commands that didn't do enough diligence and didn't do enough review? It's the same kind of negligence that causes ships to run aground. And when a ship runs aground, there's no question they're going to hold everyone accountable. Well, basically, the personnel system and the legal system ran aground. And somebody ought to be accountable. And my suggestion would be the senior people. And I believe the juniors will watch, will take notes from it, and realize that if I'm ever going to give orders that affect other people's personal lives and their futures, I better make darn sure that I understand the laws, the consequences, and the rules that we're following, not just repeat the song that the leader above, who may have different interests. And what we saw with this vaccine, they had political interests. And our military leaders, who are supposed to protect us and insulate subordinates from that, got caught up in it and imposed it.
Yeah, all good points. And exactly what we needed to hit on is one of the big things, and you brought it out, is the sheer numbers of people. Can you go after everybody? That's a question I get a lot. And I've always said that would be very difficult to do. As far as court-martialing a 4-star, it's doable, but it's very difficult to do. Thank you for laying that out as to why that answer is, because people need to hear a detailed answer, Dan. And I just appreciate you coming on today. And Rob, thank you so much for linking us up with Captain McCarthy and for coming back on the show today. I'm sure that I'll have you guys back on as we move through this. But this show can be useful for folks to have a good, solid understanding of what we can do to reestablish trust and hold the right people accountable with the right tools. Thank you very much. And I've had your X accounts up the entire show, guys, so people will know where to go and follow you. And tomorrow is Truth Thursday here on the Rob Maness Show. Sally Pipes, the author of The World's Medicine Chest, I believe is what her book is called, is going to be here to talk about DOGE going into Medicaid and Medicare, something that I've been watching for almost as much as I'm watching the DOGE effort in the Department of Defense. I'll see you then right here on Worldview Tube.
You're watching Worldview Tube, built on the 35 years of Worldview books, documentaries, research, high-profile interviews, and the radio and television broadcasts of Brandon.